Good evening, everyone. We're getting ready to start. Thank you so much for coming out on this beautiful evening and not going automatically to the Levitt Pavilion. So thank you so much. The Westport Library is happy to host journalist Samuel Freedman and his new book, Into the Bright Sunshine, Young Hubert Humphrey and the Fight for Civil Rights, which, if you didn't know, is getting lots of great press from the New York Times, The Guardian, and NPR, just to name a few. I'm going to let this author, journalist, educator, Pulitzer Prize finalist, winner of the National Book Award, winner of the National Jewish Book Award, and the New York Public Library's Helen Bernstein Award, yes, he won those all, discuss Hubert Humphrey with Westport's own Dan Gross. For those of you who don't know Dan, he's the author of A Banker's Journey and a few other books, a former senior editor at Newsweek and a columnist for the New York Times, and he has appeared on many news shows for his work in economics. This evening, we will have time for your questions after their conversation, and of course, we have copies of Into the Bright Sunshine that will be on sale and ready for signing afterward. So gents, if you would join me on stage.
Okay, great. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, well, thank you all for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight. We have a real treat tonight in Westport. Our guest, Sam Freedman, has had a really remarkable career. He graduated from the University of Wisconsin in 1977, spent much of his career at the New York Times as a staff reporter, as a columnist on education and then on religion. Someone whose byline I followed since I started reading the Times in the 80s. And his journalism has won several awards. He's written a series of books that really delve empathetically into foundational stories of the American experience, about teachers, about the Black church, on the Jewish community, on college football, and civil rights. And these too have won critical acclaim. His book, Small Victories, The Real World of a Teacher, was a finalist for the 1990 National Book Award. His book, The Inheritance, How Three Families in America Moved from Roosevelt to Reagan and Beyond, was a finalist for the 1997 Pulitzer Prize. Jew versus Jew, which is not a story about contemporary Israel, but it's about the struggle for the soul of American Jewry, won the National Jewish Book Award for Nonfiction in 2001. Sam is also revered as a teacher for, I think, more than 25 years. He's been
going on 35.
Going on 35. He's taught at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. He was named the nation's outstanding journalism educator in 1997 by the Society of Professional Journalists and received Columbia's coveted Presidential Award for Outstanding Teaching. One of those courses he teaches is a legendary course on book writing. I serve on the advisory board of a scholarship program called the Knight Badgett Program, which is at Columbia and gives mid-career journalists scholarships to attend Columbia Journalism School for a year. And every year, we hear of at least one or two students who have taken Sam's course and developed a book proposal, and many of them go on to sell. Now, there's a famous line that those who can't do teach, but this is exactly not the case, because Sam is, when it comes to books, is an expert craftsman. He constructs them very carefully. And what brings him here tonight, if you haven't read it already, is his latest book is really an exemplar of his approach and his skill. It's called Into the Bright Sunshine, Young Hubert Humphrey and the Fight for Civil Rights. It's a book about a particular moment in time. It's about this 10-minute speech that he gave at the 1948 Democratic Convention, but it's really about so much more, about American history, about things that happened before, about things that have happened since, and even current events. We should note that Sam has a Westport connection. His son, Aaron, who is here tonight, is here with his wife, Carly Mackless, who is a Westport native. Grew up, went to Staples High School. He's here with Carly's parents, Roger and Hillary. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Sam, for making the trek out to Westport. I want to start, if we can we tee up that 1 minute of the speech that sort of set Sam on this journey?
those who say that we are rushing this issue of civil rights, I say to them, we are 172 years late. To those who say that this civil rights program is an infringement on states' rights, I say this: the time has arrived in America for the Democratic Party to get out of the shadows of states' rights and to walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights. People, human beings, this is the issue of the 20th century. People of all kinds, all sorts of people. And these people are looking to America for leadership, and they're looking to America for precept and example.
So that was a very brief and stirring snippet, especially to hear the audio. It sounds like coming across that set you sort of off in some way. Like what? I just want to tee you up briefly to tell us, why did you decide to write this book now? Why with this title? Hubert Humphrey, to the extent people remember him today, he died in 78?
Early 78, yes.
45 years ago. He's remembered as LBJ's somewhat hapless vice president, a failed presidential candidate in 1968, losing to Nixon. So what drew you to him and to this topic and to this moment in history?
I will definitely answer those questions. I just want to quickly add my thanks, first of all, to Jennifer Keller and the team here at the Westport Public Library. I think partly by dint of all the attacks on libraries and librarians we've seen around the country, it lets us know how valuable they are and why they need all of our support. And also, my wonderful beloved in-laws, Roger and Hillary Mackless, who really set in motion a lot of the effort to set up this event. I'm so grateful to them and want to make them proud here in their hometown. And Dan, to be on stage with you, I've known your work and your sterling reputation for a long time, and it's an honor to share the stage with you. In terms of how I came to the book, I'd been fascinated for a long time with the period right after World War II and was looking for some kind of book that took place then. And also in my writing life, I've circled back repeatedly to issues of race and civil rights, but I'd never found the exactly right book. And I did know about this speech that Humphrey made in 1948, but what really made the lightning bolt hit me was my wife and I went to a book launch for our friend Julian Zelizer, a wonderful historian of the presidency and Congress, for a book he was writing about Johnson, with Humphrey's help, enacting the Great Society legislation. And my wife, who'd lived for many years in Minnesota, being a good Minnesotan, asked Julian in the Q&A part, what about Humphrey? And in the course of answering, Julian mentioned this speech and how it was an underappreciated landmark in civil rights. And right there, it clarified for me, this is the book. It's in the time period I've been searching for that I feel was really undercovered. It's about someone whose reputation in the collective memory is badly tarnished and whose, valorous earlier political life is almost unknown. And then I just did, the thing you do as an author in a situation like that. I emailed Julian the next morning and said, hey, if you're thinking of doing that book, I won't touch it. And he was like, no, I'm going to do this thing about Newt Gingrich and Jim Wright. And then I clicked on Amazon and on the Library of Congress's online catalog to make sure there was no book like this out there. And what that did was really confirm to me that there was a big gap. And what I came to realize is actually two related gaps. There was the gap that I've referred to already about Hubert Humphrey and the role he played in civil rights when there were precious few white Americans who were really ready to exert leadership on civil rights going back into the 1940s. And I also felt there was a gap that when we think about the civil rights movement, we tend to think that it began in the mid-50s with Brown versus Board of Ed, decision by the Supreme Court, and with Rosa Parks and Dr. King and the Montgomery bus boycott. And those, of course, are linchpin moments. But there was this amazing decade of civil rights activity in the 40s, very much motivated by World War II, that anticipates all of that. Without what happened in the 1940s, I think in many ways culminating with Humphrey's speech at the 1948 convention and its effects on the Democratic Party and on Harry Truman's candidacy, we wouldn't have the civil rights movement as we've come to know it of the 50s and 60s.
So Hubert Humphrey, you know, today you say his name, he's in the well-known liberal activist. I think in many ways he was a kind of unlikely potential champion of civil rights. He did not grow up around people whose civil rights were being denied. He grew up on the prairie in South Dakota. This is a place that has produced populists and reactionaries. I don't want to say in equal measure. It seems to produce a lot more reactionaries than populists these days. And the early chapters of his life, of a life of sort of pinched and thwarted ambition that are actually somewhat painful to read. Tell us a little about his early life, where he came from, and how it, if at all, it laid the groundwork for who he would become.
Sure, and I'd actually love to illustrate this. If you go a couple of slides into the PowerPoint, you're going to see some photographs of Dolan, South Dakota, population approximately 500, which is where, keep going. Oh, this is the wrong PowerPoint. Okay, here we go, okay. I had two different PowerPoints. That's a different one, but this slide is common to both of them. So this is Dolan, South Dakota, this little railroad town where Humphrey grows up in the eastern grasslands of South Dakota. It's almost entirely white, Northern European, Scandinavian, and British Isle Protestants. There's one Jewish family in town. There are a few blacks who work for the railroad 40 miles away. The air quote minorities in the area are a group of Roman Catholics who live in a town 10 miles away. And they're so alien that the Ku Klux Klan periodically burns crosses outside of their town. So this is about as vanilla a place as you can imagine, and so unlikely that someone who would devote much of his public life to the battles against racism and anti-Semitism would have grown up there. And Humphrey's family, his father owns and runs a local drugstore, and you can see young Hubert working for the drugstore there. And I think the first important formative thing in his life is that when we think about the Great Depression, we think of it starting with the stock market crash in 1929, and then the cascade of bank failures, and then the Dust Bowl. But I'll spare you all the details, but because of a collapse of agriculture prices in the early 1920s, the Dakotas, where Humphrey grew up, were plunged into a depression almost a decade before the rest of the country. And the Humphreys lost that beautiful house, the nicest house in town, and had to become renters in a crummy little house in the poor section of town. They ultimately lost their drugstore. And out of this experience is the beginning of Humphrey's compassion for the oppressed of a society, for the troubled of a society. And before there's a New Deal program being offered yet, he comes to this understanding that economic failure isn't a result of personal bad values or poor decisions, that there are these large-scale forces in the economic and political world that dominate over individual decision-making. And the only thing to balance them out is a government that's activist. So that's something Humphrey gets very early on. But the other thing that happens in this almost mythological way in his youth is when he's 11 years old, the big news in Dolan is that a gravel road is being put in, first gravel road in the area. And the subcontractors who are doing the graveling is a black-owned company from Omaha, Nebraska. And Humphrey is so fascinated by this curiosity of black men coming to work on the road there, and has already absorbed from his father, who's quite liberal, this idea of being open-minded, that he goes out and introduces himself to these road workers and befriends them. And they befriend him. This is when he's 11 years old. And I don't think this is dispositive for the rest of his life. I don't think one episode like that creates a civil rights activist, but it attested to something that was in his person really early on, and it mattered so much that decades later, when he's dictating what will become his autobiography, which is really ghostwritten by his communications director, Norm Sherman, he goes on and on about this episode, even though very little of it ends up in the book, but it still mattered so much to him. So those are some of the early clues of where his political orientation will end up.
So like a lot of ambitious people from that area, he makes his way to Minneapolis. He goes to the University of Minnesota. He has to unenroll to help his father. Goes back there, starts to get involved in politics. He gets his degree. He spends a year at Louisiana State University, which you could see how that would be a radicalizing experience. The amazing and somewhat actually shocking part of the book is what's going on in Minneapolis in the 30s. We think of Minnesota nice. We have Garrison Keillor and all those friendly Lutherans and Lake Wobegon. What you document here, and you're constructing them in chapters side by side, is twin and related narratives of both vicious anti-Black racism and vicious anti-Semitism that were prevalent, that, again, in a way that is shocking to me. Were you, so can you just talk a little bit, take those in tandem, that there was a kind of hotbed of structural racism in this lovely city on the plains. What was that about, and what were some of the manifestations that he saw and some of the things that sort of shocked you?
Well, I'm going to show you. Let's go forward another couple of slides, and there will be some illustrations. Keep going. All right, this tells you something about Minneapolis and its history of anti-Semitism right here, and its history of racism. And you're right, Minneapolis in the 20s and 30s and early 40s is seen in certain ways as this kind of liberal beacon. Its political party, the Farmer Labor Party, which does vie for power statewide with the Republican Party, is very much seemingly a party of the left. And yet, Minneapolis is also a city with incredible entrenched bigotry against both Blacks and Jews. And complicit in that are not only people like Gerald L.K. Smith, who's a regular speaker in town, Senator Ernest Lundeen, a pro-Nazi senator who was giving speeches.
Gerald Smith was the leader of the
America First political...
Proud Boys of his day.
The Proud Boys of his day. There was a group of pro-Nazis called the Silver Shirts who regularly held rallies in Minneapolis. And these rallies were attended in spite of what the Minneapolis mainstream establishment said, not just by the riffraff and the dirtbags and the great unwashed. At Silver Shirts rallies, you'd have the president of the Board of Education. You'd have the president of the Businessmen's Association. You would have doctors and dentists and teachers, the elites. And even on the side of organized labor in Minneapolis, the labor unions there were as racist as management was. Blacks could not get into any labor unions there except for the black-run union for hotel workers. And the demography really explains a lot. Minneapolis is a city in which white Protestants, again, Scandinavian, German, British Isles, are the overwhelming majority of the population. And they're not going to let any of the minority populations forget it. Interestingly, right next door is St. Paul, where Catholics are the plurality, and the Catholics know that they're a minority within the region, so the Catholics in St. Paul make political alliances with Blacks and Jews. You know, Blacks can join labor unions in St. Paul. They can't join them in Minneapolis. Jews become judges and public officials and elected officials in St. Paul, not in Minneapolis. In Minneapolis, a Jew couldn't belong to the AAA. You couldn't belong to the auto club there, even. Blacks would be told, you should be grateful that you're here. We're not like the South. We don't lynch you. You get to vote. You get to work, of course, as long as your jobs are either being a domestic or being a hotel porter or busboy, so stop complaining. But the minute a Black family helmed by a war veteran from World War I who works for the post office tries to buy a home in a white neighborhood in 1931, night after night, thousands of white people besiege it to terrorize the family, to try to drive them out. When a lawyer who's very active in anti-defamation work, named Sam Shiner, who becomes very influential on Humphrey and won't be hired by any law firms because he's a Jew, tries to buy a house in an adjacent suburb, the windows are shot out as a message that Jews shouldn't live there. And all of this goes really unchallenged, and it goes excused by the good people of Minneapolis, by the newspaper editors, by the major ministers, by elected officials. And this is what Humphrey and his allies have to do battle against.
So Humphrey, again, I think sort of point that many of the early chapters, it's a story of kind of thwarted ambition. Very smart guy, wasn't quite sure how to channel it all. World War II comes along. He keeps trying to volunteer for the army. They won't take him because of his various conditions. He runs for mayor in '43 and loses, but he is sort of trying to assemble a local coalition that ultimately prevails in 1945. Tell me how that came together, who the key figures in that were.
Well, the first thing to understand is that the transformational year of Humphrey's life is when he goes to get a master's degree in Baton Rouge, Louisiana at LSU. And he goes there for the simple reason they'll give him $400 to be a graduate assistant. And he's newly married and has a young baby, and he and his wife Muriel need that money. But when he goes to Baton Rouge, he's plunged into a Jim Crow society for the first time in his life. Interestingly, he meets Jews for the first time in his life. One of his debate team friends at LSU tells the story of his 5 uncles who were all trapped under Nazi control in Europe and will all be exterminated. And he studies at LSU under this amazing professor named Rudolph Eberle, who's a 1/8 Jewish, anti-Nazi, exiled professor, who, when Humphrey studies with him, Eberle is both telling him about the field work he had done, exploring the question of how does a democracy become a dictatorship within 3 or 4 years. He tells him about his family's experience of dispossession and life as refugees coming to the U.S. And he also draws a direct parallel between the treatment of Jews in Nazi Germany and the treatment of blacks in America, and specifically the Jim Crow South. That really gives Humphrey the prism through which he will then experience Minneapolis. So when he goes back north after grad school, it's not like, glad I'm out of, the deep South and going back to, the tolerant North. To the contrary, he now has eyes to see what's been in Minneapolis all along in terms of its racism and anti-Semitism, but he'd been oblivious to it. And he comes back and he's alert to it. And he finds 2 enduringly important tutors. One is the Jewish lawyer, Sam Shiner, who I mentioned before, who's been kind of a one-man anti-defamation league. The other is a black newspaper publisher and editor named Cecil Newman. And Newman and Shiner are friends and collaborate a lot because they understand, particularly against the backdrop of Hitler's rise in Germany, that the battle against anti-Semitism and the battle against racism are really one battle, and they must collaborate with each other. But fundamentally, Dan, they're powerless. The black and Jewish communities in Minneapolis comprise maybe 3% of the total population. They're not a voting bloc that can tilt an election. And they've had no political advocates, really, ever. And then Humphrey, kind of remarkably, begins to build his political career. And when he runs for mayor the second time in 1945, he does this astonishing thing, which is just to run on a platform of human rights and civil rights, even though it seems to make no electoral sense. And yet there's this moment, I think, in the American consciousness with the war coming to an end, with the revelation of the Holocaust, with the realization of the sacrifices black soldiers made on behalf of a country that treated them at best as second-class citizens, if it would even accept them as human beings at all. There's this moment when people on the home front too are saying, what kind of country are we going to be? And there are a lot of returning war veterans coming back to the University of Minnesota who've had that experience. And I think it gives Humphrey this opening to appeal to voters who wouldn't have heard his message 2 years earlier and might not have heard it 5 years later, but they were receptive to it in 1945.
So he, in 1945, is able to put together a coalition that includes blacks, Jews, progressive whites, labor unions,
yes,
returning veterans. This sounds a lot like the New Deal coalition, with the exception of Southern whites. And, he was a big Democrat. He was a huge New Deal. He revered FDR. And we know now, I think it's much more highlighted, that for all we may revere FDR and his accomplishments, that he made a series of accommodations and compromises with white supremacy to get his agenda through or stay in power. This was a elemental part of the New Deal coalition, was the whites in the South, so that blacks were excluded from Social Security, from all sorts of laws and programs. Like the only way they would let these go in is if they were exclude blacks. So it's an uncomfortable, I think, sort of truth for as we look at FDR's legacy today, and it was a uncomfortable thing for him and Democrats in the North to confront at the time when, frankly, the Republicans, going back to Lincoln, had a more of a line to sort of African American votes in the Northeast, where they were free to vote. So this is what starts to crystallize in 45, 46, 47. Tell us how he emerges from just being a mayor of a large city, but it's a mayor out in the Midwest, to becoming a voice for civil rights nationally, and what the either advocacy / resistance of Harry Truman was at the time. What was he pushing?
No, great questions, Dan. I mean, the first thing is Humphrey begins to get on the national radar because within a few years of being mayor, he pushes through one of the nation's first fair employment laws that has real teeth in it. He's on the verge of passing a law against restrictive covenants in housing before the Supreme Court ultimately declares them unconstitutional. And he's transforming Minneapolis' reputation from what's considered one of the most racist and the most anti-Semitic big city in the country to this beacon of progress. But he's still fundamentally a relatively local politician. But he's part of a group of liberals who come together in this group called the Americans for Democratic Action, whose actually initial hope had been to oust Harry Truman and to get anybody but Truman to be the Democratic nominee for president. Eisenhower, William O. Douglas, Claude Pepper, you name it, none of them enter the race. So they're stuck with Truman, and then they decide the big issue of the 1948 convention is going to be civil rights, because as you said, going back to Lincoln, the Republicans are seen as a party of civil rights. Their nominee, Thomas Dewey, had a good civil rights record as governor of New York. Henry Wallace, who's broken away from the Democratic Party, FDR's former ag secretary and vice president, and is running for president on the Progressive Party, is extremely bold on civil rights. He's venturing into the Deep South to give speeches endorsing civil rights. And so Humphrey understands, and the people in the ADA understand, that first of all, morally, they must take the stand, that the devil's bargain FDR made with the Southern segregationists is completely untenable. It can't be sustained. It's a contradiction not only within democratic liberalism, it's a contradiction within the Cold War and the idea that the United States is trying to offer liberal democracy as the model for these soon-to-be decolonized countries in Africa and Asia and Central and South America. And how can you say that liberal democracy is the path you should take as opposed to Marxist-Leninism when liberal democracy in the U.S. embraces racism, embraces Jim Crow? So that's part of what's driving this forward. And what's fascinating about Truman is he's really divided within himself. He comes from a background of Confederates and slaveholders, but he was someone who was affected by these episodes right after World War II when black veterans would come back literally in uniform in the South, and that was considered such an affront to see a black person in the uniform that many of them were attacked, some of them were killed by white vigilantes, and the case that really affects Truman's heart is a returning sergeant named Isaac Woodard, who's pulled off a bus in South Carolina by the local sheriff, who gouges out his eyes. And amazingly, Woodard goes on to speak on a national tour about civil rights. And so Truman is deeply affected by this, and he begins to move forward in a way kind of anticipating Lyndon Johnson years later to propose civil rights legislation. But then he looks at the calendar and it's like, uh-oh, November 1948 is out there, and I have to run for election. I'm going to revert to the FDR playbook. We're going to appease and placate the Southern segregationists. We're going to keep them in the tent. We're going to hope that the liberals have nowhere else to go. And he wants to back away. He wants at the convention the delegates to do what they always did for FDR, which was put in civil rights language that was so vague and fuzzy and equivocal that the Southern segregationists could interpret it as allowing them what they called states' rights, meaning the right of a state to run a Jim Crow system. And when Humphrey and his insurgents are mounting their challenge to that, they know a couple of things. They know that they're going against Truman's wishes, and Truman's people at the convention are telling Humphrey, if you give this civil rights speech, your career is over. They know that the Southern segregationists have promised to walk out of the convention if there is a word of civil rights language in the platform, and they're going to run their own candidate and try to keep Harry Truman from carrying states in the South. And by the way, talking about the past as the present, we've had the experience of people who want to have elections sent to the House of Representatives. That was the plan of the Dixiecrats, that neither Truman nor Dewey would win a majority, and then both parties would have to come on bent knee to the segregationists in the House of Representatives and promise to preserve Jim Crow in exchange for their votes. So they're threatening to leave, and then literally outside the convention hall, the great labor and civil rights leader, A. Philip Randolph, is leading protest marches as part of his campaign to tell black young men, don't register for the draft and do not serve if you were called up until Harry Truman desegregates the military. So this is a convention almost like any other in terms of the high drama and the uncertain result. And Humphrey, as this kid, right, 37 years old, only 3 years in elective office, mayor of the 17th largest city, he's right in the middle of this. He is the public face of this challenge to Truman and this defiance of the segregationists.
And you're right, at the moment, so he comes in and gives a speech. He was famously long-winded. People were concerned about that. This was, of course, of a time where people really listened to and paid, like the radio and audience for this was likely tens of millions?
60 million people listened on radio, and they had just begun to have TV service in the Northeast. The two political conventions, Republican and Democrat, that summer were the first ones carried on TV. So 10 million people are watching him on TV. So the cumulative audience for his speech is 70 million people. It's like the Super Bowl audience.
So he stands up in front of the screen, including the incumbent president, all the sort of grandees from the South, this kind of skinny, nerdy kid from Minnesota. And if we could tee up that audio one more time, please. This is the message he delivers.
My friends, to those who say that we are rushing this issue of civil rights, I say to them, we are 172 years late.
Listen to the boos, right? Listen to the boos.
To those who say that this civil rights program is an infringement on states' rights, I say this: the time has arrived in America for the Democratic Party to get out of the shadows of states' rights and to walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights.
More boos.
People, human beings, this is the issue of the 20th century. People of all kinds, all sorts of people. And these people are looking to America for leadership, and they're looking to America for precept and example.
What's amazing, as you point out, the equal or comparative of boos and cheers, which is exactly sort of what happened in the Democratic Party, and it's really the story of our politics in many ways for the last 70-something years. Strom Thurmond walks out. This begins the movement of the South towards the Republican. It's many years, LBJ, when he signs the Civil Rights Act, says, I've sort of signed away the South for I don't know if he said a generation.
It turned foreseeable future.
Yeah, it turns out it was for the foreseeable future and then some. Last, before I want to get to people's questions, but Minneapolis, of course, has its own history and continuing history with racial issues and structural racism. And among academic historians, presentism, the idea of looking at the past through the lens of the present or making comparisons is a sin. But for journalists like you and me, it's the whole point. And one can't help but read this and so much about Minneapolis, and you do talk about it at the end of your book. But how should what we read in these pages make us think either differently or about what happened with the George Floyd episode in Minnesota.
Well, there's no question that in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and in the aftermath of these episodes of anti-Semitism around the country, the Tree of Life massacre, the Unite the Right rally, that one is tempted to feel like maybe we never made any progress. Maybe what Humphrey was pushing for failed. And I think that's the wrong takeaway. I think the message is that these battles need to be fought anew in almost every generation. That the battle that Humphrey and his allies were involved with in the 1940s was the battle of inclusive, multiracial, interfaith democracy against autocracy, an autocracy that had the same names then as it has now. Christian nationalism, white supremacy, America Firstism. Those are the exact terms in Humphrey's time. And the successes that Humphrey had are real. In the aftermath of his convention speech when the Democratic Party endorsed civil rights, Truman, 2 weeks later, desegregates the military and the federal workforce. He wins election in 1948 because of a surge of black voters. And even though the promises of 48 then lay latent for a while, once LBJ becomes president and Humphrey's initially in the Senate and then vice president, those promises are followed through on in the form of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act. So that's not naivete and false optimism or false hope. Those things happened. But one of the lessons of American history is that whenever there's progress, there's backlash. We see it from Reconstruction to now. And we're in one of these periods of battling against backlash again. And so I think that actually Humphrey offers, I think, a very usable model of a mixture of moral imagination and practical political skills, his great talent at building coalitions, his optimism and vigor, I think, are all useful models today because it is another version of the battles he was fighting all through the 1940s.
Well, that's a fantastic summation, not only of why we should read the book now, but also that how it should inform our thinking about the news we read. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time and for coming here. I'd like to thank the audience for their attention. And we have some time for questions.
Please, if you could step up to the mic with your questions so everybody can hear, that would be most appreciated. Thank you.
The Vietnam War, why did he back it for so long, and what were his calculations?
I'm sorry, with the echo, I had a little trouble here.
The Vietnam War.
Oh, the Vietnam.
Why did he back it for so long?
Okay, why did Humphrey back the Vietnam War? And this is, of course, the great mistake of his political life, as he's later acknowledged. I think there are a couple of reasons. One is that he was constructed in such a way to be loyal to his political party and loyal to his president. But I think people are mistaken when they try to actually give Humphrey a bit of a free pass and say he was only supporting the war out of that loyalty. Humphrey was a cold warrior. He was a great liberal on civil rights, but he was also a fierce anti-communist. He had been through battles within the state of Minnesota between Communist Party members and fellow travelers over who would control the newly created Democrat Farmer Labor Party. And my feeling is that he overinterpreted out of that experience in Minneapolis both how widespread communist subversion was in the U.S., and it made him a soft touch for the domino theory as an idea of geopolitics. And I think all that led him to make a grievously wrong decision about Vietnam, just as Johnson did. You know, we listened to the LBJ tapes from the LBJ library, and you hear Johnson talking to Richard Russell and other people in the mid-'60s about how big a mistake he knows Vietnam is, even as he's escalating it. And Humphrey similarly was of two minds. He, at points, was arguing against escalation, but he could also talk himself very willingly into escalation. And he sure paid the political price for it, and, you know, deservedly so.
Hi. So I noticed the second time listening to the speech that he used the word people to be describing the group that we're talking about, and didn't divide by using the word people, from different races or everything, and about human rights also. So as we have used other terms, can you recommend or notice how through history those things have changed, and how those things might separate us, and any other tips that, how to build coalitions and not just stay on your side,
Well, I think Humphrey, first of all, was very ahead of his time in acknowledging difference and addressing it. And one of the gaps of the New Deal and of a purely class-based politics is that, okay, if incidentally improving economic conditions will address the, different forms of oppression visited upon racial or religious minorities, well, that's fine as sort of an unintended side effect. But Humphrey realized that wasn't enough, that you had to directly take on forms of bigotry as well, and you couldn't just depend on a politics of economic class to incidentally address those issues. And when he put together the coalitions that he did very effectively as mayor of Minneapolis, he was making sure to really people them with representatives from all kinds of different factions within Minneapolis, labor and management, Jewish and Christian, white and black, Nisei Japanese, men and women, religious and secular people. So I think actually his idea wasn't to pretend these differences don't exist, but to acknowledge and embrace them in a way that was frankly ahead of its time, and to say, but let's figure out what we agree upon. So his two big initiatives with these citizens committees he formed as mayor was police reform, because he was dealing with a highly bigoted and violent and out-of-control police force in the 40s. And the tragedy of his quick upward mobility into national politics is that that agenda was never finished. It never took hold, and we saw the result with George Floyd's murder. But the other one was working on issues of civil rights and human rights. And he got these people who would be on the opposite sides of strike lines, who'd be on the opposite sides of theology, who'd be on the opposite sides of gender, and said, for the moment, let's just forget what we disagree on. But if everyone in this room agrees we need to reform the police force, if everyone in this room agrees we need to pass a fair employment law and stop housing discrimination, then let's work together on that. And I think that's, a sign of a really effective, practical politician. And I think it also says that there isn't this impossible divide between pragmatism in terms of how you get things done politically and, to use a term I used before, moral imagination. And there's this amazing exchange of letters and telegrams that happened after the 1948 convention between Humphrey and some of A. Philip Randolph's top leaders in the movement, as they called it, against the Jim Crow military. And the people from Randolph's draft resistant movement are complimenting Humphrey on what he accomplishes inside the convention hall. And Humphrey's writing back to them and saying, I couldn't have done it if you weren't protesting outside the convention hall. You need both. It isn't either or, and one without the other will never succeed. And I think that's another real takeaway right up to the present day out of his example.
First of all, thank you. I've really enjoyed your presentation. I'm curious, in the Caro books about Johnson, there's so much about the movement towards civil rights action. What was the interplay between Humphrey and Johnson? How much did Humphrey influence Johnson to move in that direction?
That's a great question, and I certainly will defer not only to the magisterial Robert Caro, but to Robert Dallek and Nick Kotz and the other terrific narrative historians who've dealt with that period.
By the way, I think Robert Caro started writing his biography of Johnson in 1948.
It's time well spent, regardless. I think Humphrey's influence is probably indirect, but it's mostly that he was an early adopter, that he's active on civil rights by the early 1940s. And you have to understand that if you go into the 1930s, the only white people who are active on civil rights are members of the Communist Party. And Humphrey's great black ally and influence, Cecil Newman, the newspaper editor, is writing editorials in the 1930s saying we black voters should vote for the communists because they're the only white people who take up our cause. And so Humphrey is very early on one of the handful of non-CP members who's active on civil rights. He's on this issue 15 years before Johnson is, and I think that had to have had some effect. But I think Johnson had his own body, as we know from Caro's amazing work, of experiences, teaching in a Mexican-American school that really, I'm reminded of Johnson when I looked at Harry Truman, because they're both from border states. There's nothing in either of their pasts that predicts they should care about civil rights. And obviously Johnson achieves much more in the end than Truman does. But just like Truman was so affected by the blinding of Isaac Woodard, Johnson was so affected by his time teaching in this Mexican-American school that ideas of dealing with racial prejudice head on stayed with him. And I don't see Humphrey as an influence as much as a vital wingman. And the thing that brought it home to me most is, although my book mostly ends in 1948 and has a little bit about the last year of Humphrey's life in 1977 and early 78, I did read in the state archives in Minnesota a lot of his correspondence as senator and vice president to try to find people from earlier in his life who he was still in touch with. That's how I found out about Rudolph Eberle, by the way. But in those papers was Humphrey's hand-marked tally sheet of the vote in the Senate on what was called cloture. To get the Civil Rights Act passed in '64, the hard part wasn't to get 51 votes in favor of it. The hard part was to get a 2/3 majority to stop the Southern filibuster. And that vote was called a cloture vote. And Humphrey kept for the rest of his life this long sheet of paper, kind of newsprint, with every senator's name on it, that he ticked off in pencil how they were voting on cloture to prove to himself that they were actually going to win. And so I think that's really the role he plays with Johnson, not so much an influence, but an absolutely vital ally. And I think also when Johnson chose Humphrey as his vice presidential running mate, that was a sign to the civil rights community, even for those people who still doubted Johnson's goodwill even after the Civil Rights Act had been passed, that I'm serious about this. Look who I chose for my running mate, the most important white figure in civil rights in this entire country. And so I think that's the interplay. But I don't think it would be true to say that Johnson was influenced by Humphrey to sort of take up these ideas. He had his own path to them.
Great, thank you. This is awesome. Minneapolis and Minnesota also had a legacy of bias and discrimination against Native Americans. Did your research reveal that Humphrey also acknowledged that? And did he take any initiatives or make any efforts toward advocating for the Native Americans?
It's a great question, and there's no doubt that that's also part of the Minneapolis story, and you see it often written about in the novels of Louise Erdrich to this day. I didn't find that much evidence that Humphrey took it on directly. I'm not sure at the point he was mayor in the 40s if the real influx from reservations and tribal lands into the city had really happened. Yet I think it was beginning, but it took more hold a bit later on into the 50s and 60s. And when I had a summer internship on the Minneapolis Star in 1977, I clearly remember that community being very present and obviously being a subject of discrimination and disparagement, but it wasn't a big part. I think beyond the blacks and Jews, actually the most significant minority community he championed was Japanese Americans, because very interestingly, there's an army base right on the Minneapolis-St. Paul border called Fort Snelling that was used, among other things, for Japanese Americans to become code breakers. A lot of these were from families whose parents and siblings and children had been incarcerated by FDR, and some of them enlisted or were drafted, and that was at least way out of their concentration camps in the far west, and they came to Minneapolis to become code breakers, and a lot of them decided rather than going back to the hostile environs of California or Oregon or Washington, they would stay in Minneapolis, where then they were also subject to prejudice immediately. And that was the other group beyond blacks and Jews that Humphrey really connected with and really advocated for.
Hi, it seems to be beyond the subject of your book, but could you talk about how why Minneapolis backslid over the, from Humphrey's time till today to become
No,
the
it's
exact
something.
opposite of what it stood for?
It's something I think about a lot. I've lived, portions of the last 8 years that I worked on this book in Minneapolis, so it's very front of mind for me. I think that Minneapolis has dealt with in Humphrey's times, or didn't, and certainly beforehand, and continues to deal with a kind of a liberal complacency and an idea that we're kind of so blue here and we're so enlightened. How could we be in any way presiding over a racially unequal city? And that's always been an obstacle there. I think on the policing issue in particular, there have been other reform mayors since Humphrey. Humphrey had a great police chief named Ed Ryan, who also quickly had more upward mobility and moved on to higher things before he could really achieve the reform program, which, by the way, included sending the whole police force for human relations training at the University of Minnesota, and Humphrey personally interceding in cases of false arrest and police brutality. But beyond Humphrey and Ryan, there are other reform mayors, there are other reform police chiefs, many of whom were hired from outside Minneapolis, but they ran into the same two obstacles. They ran into a police union that's extremely powerful and protects its own and resists reform. And they ran into kind of an internal police culture that's very inbred, and that, because there's no residency requirement for cops in Minneapolis, involves, white Protestants, for the most part, who live in the exurbs or even the rural outskirts beyond there, and see their police work as coming in to kind of tame the savages. And those have been the pervasive problems that continue to recur, and I think that's why some of the backsliding has happened. And the one other thing I'll add, and this is a story of many American cities, is that in Humphrey's time, the Black and Jewish neighborhoods, the Black and Jewish slums, to be honest, were right next to each other on the north side of Minneapolis, but they were contiguously part of the whole city. They were near downtown. Then Jews became metaphorically white enough and prosperous enough to move into better neighborhoods or into the suburbs. The Black community was still penned in there, and then the interstate highways came through and blasted a hole through what had been working poor, but in many ways vibrant, vital neighborhoods. And so if you're in Minneapolis today, the main Black neighborhood on the north side is really geographically separated from the rest of the city. It's as if it's in a different state because it's just cut off by a whole bunch of 6 or 8 lanes of highways. And I think that contributes to the complacency because there's very much, geographically speaking, an out of sight, out of mind mentality that goes with that. And then the last thing I'll say is that something Minneapolis has done very well is refugee resettlement, with Somalis, with Ethiopians, with Congolese, with Liberians, with Hmong, with Karen, with Vietnamese. And I think the excellent work the city has done with those non-white populations has allowed it to avert its eyes from the inattention to the African-American population.
I think we have time for 2 more quick questions and answers.
This is quick. I wanted to tell you that I heard you on NPR, and I thought you were fabulous, and that's why I came tonight, so thank you for still being fabulous.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. I want to assure you she's not on my payroll.
My quick question is, what is it like to teach young people about this stuff? All of us are old, and we remember these people in person. And so what is a highlight that you can cite, actually both of you, of people that are under, say, 30 or 40 or something? That is it because it reminds them of current events now, or are they simply impressed with your historical highlights?
Well, if only. Look, I think that young people, and I see this in my Columbia students all the time, are so alert to these issues already. They don't need, as we would say in Yiddish, an Altekocker like me to tell them about these issues. I think what I can bring to them is a sense that we've had to fight these battles before. They've been struggles. They've been won, but victories aren't permanent. And I think also, particularly with Humphrey, to use current language, he's the epitome of an ally. He was not the white savior. He was the ally, and that's a really critical difference. When he gives the speech in 48, the first telegram he gets, and by the way, there's a ton of hate mail as well, but the first telegram he gets isn't from his wife Muriel. She's the second one. The first one is from Cecil Newman. And Cecil Newman congratulates Humphrey on your great victory and God bless you. And here's the key thing, and the thing that I would want to communicate to younger readers. When Humphrey writes back to Newman, he says, this wasn't my victory, this was our victory. People like you were fighting this battle for decades. And I think it's that humility and that willingness to be a partner that's also part of what's really important about someone like Humphrey.
Thank you again for your time. It's been a wonderful talk. And again, maybe outside the scope of the book a little bit, and I think you, with the last part of that last answer, you may have answered it. But I'm always interested when politicians, leaders lose, so when he loses the White House in '68 and then decide to go back into service, because I know he goes back into the Senate up until he passed away or shortly before. So I was wondering if you had any insight into why he made that decision?
It's a great question. I think Humphrey was committed to public life, and I think it's very hard to have been within a hair's breadth of the presidency and then say, I'm just going to retire. Also, he was treated abysmally when he went back to Minnesota. Remember, he was still associated with the Vietnam War and with the police riot at the Chicago Convention in '68. Gene McCarthy, a senator from Minnesota, was the hero of the anti-war movement. And when Humphrey lost and came back to Minnesota, they tried to find a faculty job for him at the University of Minnesota. And the faculty, used the excuse if he doesn't have a doctorate to deny it to him. And eventually, the university found kind of a backdoor way to get him hired as untraditional faculty, and there was an association of untraditional faculty who played poker together socially, and they wouldn't let Humphrey join their poker games. So I think also there is a hunger and a need for approval that drives a lot of politicians that also would lead him to go back to where I can get approval and also to where I can be of service again. But it was like being bucked back to private, because the way the Senate works, even though he had served 3 terms in the Senate before becoming vice president, when he returns in 1970, he has no seniority. He's on the worst committees, he's given the worst offices, and so it was also a bit of a humiliation at the same time. But I think this is where this ebullient part of Humphrey that's very easy to ridicule because it seems so corny did serve him well, that he was going to somehow try to make the best of his time. And something I've talked about with my son Aaron, who's a history doctoral student, is something Humphrey was trying to do at the very end of his life in '76, '77, was push through a law that would guarantee full employment. He wanted this to be basically the next chapter of the New Deal and the Great Society. As it turned out, the law got watered down so much it ended up being meaningless, but he was still passionate about these issues right up until the end.
Thank you.
I get the last question. First of all, the entire speech from the 48 convention is available on, you can go on YouTube. It's a very kind of crackling, but it's worth the whole 10 minutes because it leads up to all of this. So I would recommend everybody go listen to that. We were talking before, some of the most memorable speeches at political conventions were not given by the ultimate winners or even the nominees. There's the Cross of Gold speech in 1896. This speech, Kennedy in 76? 80, excuse me. Where do you put this? Give me 3 other speeches by sort of either not, I don't want to say losers, but people who were not either the presidential candidate or who went on to become president, but that nailed something that was about to happen in American politics.
Great ending question. And I want to say that when I'm citing these speeches, in one case in particular, it's not because I approve of the content, it's because of the historical importance. So I think along with Humphrey's 48 speech, I would say Barack Obama's speech in 2004, which was really a framing of even more multiracial, inclusive version of the Democratic Party that ultimately became the Obama coalition in 2008 and in 2012. And I would say Patrick Buchanan's culture war speech in 1992, which really anticipates Trumpism. That's his, peasants with pitchforks speech that seems so appalling to the Republican Party of George H.W. Bush, but that was pointing where the party was going, just as surely as in their own ways, Humphrey's and Obama's speeches were pointing towards approximate future.
And as we speak, the peasants with pitchforks are gathering in Milwaukee or somewhere, I gather. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you, Sam, so much for writing this book. I hope everybody should go buy a copy, as I have, and make this book even a bigger success. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. We have books for sale over here that our esteemed author will be signing if you'd like to purchase.